The Knoxville Zoo in East Tennessee is one of those places that just feels like the heart of the community. It's a spot for family outings where the sound of kids laughing plays over the calls of exotic birds. And of course, it's a sanctuary for incredible animals looked after by a team of dedicated keepers. Among them, one man was known for a special connection with the zoo's largest and maybe most intelligent residents. He was quiet, reserved, and seemed to have this calm empathy that made him perfect for a life spent with gentle giants. His name was Thomas Husky, and he took care of the elephants. He was a trusted guy, a familiar face at a beloved local spot, and his daily work seemed to prove his compassion and patience. People just saw him as a gentle soul, a lot like the magnificent creatures he looked after. But that whole compassionate zookeeper thing, it was a mask. When the sun went down and the zoo locked its gates for the night, a completely different and much darker side of Thomas Husky came out. The hands that gently cared for the elephants by day became instruments of terror in the dark. He swapped his hunting grounds from the zoo enclosures to the lonely, forgotten streets of Knoxville. This is the disturbing story of how a man's public life caring for animals hid a secret life of preying on vulnerable people, earning him the nickname that would haunt the city for decades, the Zoo Man. How could someone who spent his life caring for living beings be capable of such awful brutality? The answer is a mess of a fractured mind, a botched investigation, and a courtroom drama so bizarre it would test the very definition of guilt and innocence. To really get why this story was such a betrayal, you have to know a little bit about Knoxville in the early 1990s and the man everyone thought they knew. Back then, Knoxville was a city tucked into the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, a place that still had a small town feel even as it was growing. It was the kind of community where people knew their neighbors and took a lot of pride in local institutions, and the Knoxville Zoo was at the top of that list. It wasn't just a place with animals. It was a cornerstone of the community, a center for education, conservation, and family members. Right at the heart of the zoo's most popular exhibit, the Elephant Sanctuary, was Thomas D. Husky. And get this, he was a second-generation zoo employee. His own father, Frank, was a respected elephant trainer, and Tom had just followed in his footsteps. For people looking in, his family legacy just made him seem even more dedicated to his work. And anyone who knew him would tell you he was mild-mannered, polite, and kept to himself. He didn't try to be the center of attention. He just did his job, and by all accounts, he did it well, with a quiet focus that suggested a real connection with the animals. Elephants are incredibly smart, with complex social lives and deep emotions, and working with them takes a special kind of patience, respect, and intuition. Huskies seem to have all of that. He was there for them every day, feeding them, checking their health, and making sure they were okay. This role built up his image as a protector, a guardian. He wasn't just a zookeeper. He was the elephant man, and his life seemed totally intertwined with these symbols of gentle strength. He lived with his parents in Pigeon Forge, which just added to the picture of him as a simple, family-oriented guy. In 1992, he was 32 years old, divorced with 2 kids. On the surface, his life looked pretty unremarkable, almost boring. A man who went to work, cared for amazing animals, and went home. This normal guy act was the greatest weapon. Nobody looked at the quiet man from the elephant barn and saw a monster. Nobody guessed that his detailed knowledge of the zoo's layout, all its hidden corners and service roads, would be used for something so dark. And nobody could imagine that his gentle nature was just a front, hiding a range of violence that was about to spill out and stain the community with a fear it would never forget. The gentle giant of the Knoxville Zoo had a secret, and the city was about to become his personal hunting ground. As 1992 rolled on, the quiet vibe of life in East Knox County was shattered by a growing feeling of dread. A shadow was creeping over the edges of the city, targeting women on the fringes of society. Women who might disappear without setting off immediate widespread alarm. The first whispers of trouble came from Knoxville's community of street workers. These women, who were already navigating a risky life, started to notice a terrifying pattern. Their friends and colleagues were vanishing, one by one. The first to be found was 23-year-old Darlene Smith. Then came Susan Stone, who was 30. Then Patricia Rose Anderson, 32. And finally, 31-year-old Patricia Johnson. 4 women, all connected by their dangerous line of work, all meeting the same horrific end. Their bodies were dumped and found in the woods in a place known as the locals' Lover's Lane. It was a place people went to be unseen, and a predator had turned it into his own personal dumping ground. What law enforcement found was pure brutality. The women had been viciously assaulted. They were raped, strangled, and some had been tied up with rope, a grim signature of a killer obsessed with control. Finding the first victim was shocking, but as days and weeks passed, the body count grew. A hunter stumbled upon one body hidden under an old mattress, and when police searched the area, they found 2 more, one recent and one that had been there for a while. When the skeletal remains of the 4th victim was discovered, the horrifying truth was undeniable. This is the work of a serial killer. A predator was actively hunting in their city. The victims were prostitutes, and that fact both shaped the investigation and tragically kept the initial public outcry pretty muted. These were women whose lives were already filled with danger, and they were often overlooked. Their killer knew this. He was counting on it. He chose them because he thought they were disposable, that their disappearance wouldn't make big waves. And for a while, he was right. The fear was sharpest among the women on the streets, who now saw every potential client as a possible threat. They knew a monster was out there, but they had no idea what he looked like. But that fear slowly started to bleed into the rest of the community. A real-life horror story was playing out just off the interstate in the woods right next to their neighborhoods. The name Kahaba Lane became a synonym for death. Knoxville, a city that prided itself on safety and community, was now a home to a killer who treated human lives like they were worthless. The police had a serial murder on their hands, 4 victims and terrifyingly few leads. They had no witnesses, no suspects, and no clues where he would strike next. The shadow over Knoxville was getting longer and darker every day. With 4 bodies discovered and the community terrified, the Knox County Sheriff's Office and the Knoxville Police Department were under a ton of pressure. The hunt for the Kahaba Lane killer started as a frustrating search for a ghost. The victim's lifestyle made it tough to track their last known movements, and the remote dumping ground didn't offer many clues at first. The killer was like a phantom who preyed on the city's vulnerable and then just disappeared into the night. The first real break in the case didn't come from forensics. No fingerprints, no DNA. It came from the hushed, terrified whispers of women who had actually survived him. As detectives dug into the world of Knoxville's sex workers, a chilling story began to take shape. Several women came forward with accounts of a client who was particularly brutal, a man they had nicknamed the Zoo Man. And that nickname wasn't random. It was literal. The women said this client often took them to secluded spots near or even on the grounds of the Knoxville Zoo to have sex. They described a dark, intimidating man who subjected them to terrifying, violent assaults. Some even recalled being taken to the exact same remote spots off Kahaba Lane where the victims' bodies were later found. They talked about his brutality, how he would tie them up and assault them, how many women had learned to fear him and tried to stay away. But for those who desperately needed the money, it was a risk they sometimes felt they had to take. Suddenly, the nickname Zoo Man wasn't just street talk anymore. It was the single biggest lead in the county's largest ever murder investigation. The Phantom now had a potential workplace, and the investigation took a sharp turn, focusing on a place no one had ever considered, the beloved local zoo. The thought that a trusted employee of a family-friendly institution could be the monster they were hunting was almost unbelievable. But the stories were too similar to ignore. As investigators focused on the zoo, one name floated to the top: Thomas D. Husky, the elephant keeper, the quiet, reserved guy. And when they looked into his background, a disturbing history started to surface. Husky wasn't just a quiet zookeeper. He had a prior criminal history. And the most damning part, he'd been arrested in February of 1992, months before the first body was even found for rape. And the location of that arrest was Kahaba Lane. A Knoxville police detective named Tom Presley had been led to that very spot by another woman who claimed Husky had assaulted her. And when they showed up, they found Husky in the act with another naked woman. He was arrested, but the case completely fell apart when the victims, likely scared or just unwilling to deal with the court system, refused to testify. And Husky, well, he just walked free. For investigators, this was a sickening realization. They had their man in custody months earlier at the exact location he would use as a dumping ground. For the exact type of crimes he was now suspected of escalating to murder. Prosecutors would later guess that this was a turning point for Husky. He learned from his mistakes. He decided that the next time he wasn't going to leave any witness behind, and the hunt for the zoo man was no longer a search for a ghost. It was a race to prove a man hiding in plain sight, the gentle elephant keeper, was the serial killer and terrorizing their city. By late 1992, the two worlds of Thomas Husky were about to crash into each other in a big way. Armed with the terrifying testimony from the surviving women and the knowledge of Husky's prior arrest at Kahaba Lane, investigators finally made their move. The time for watching from a distance was over. It was time to unmask the zoo killer. The arrest of Thomas D. Husky sent a shockwave through Knoxville. The guy who was a familiar face at the zoo, the quiet keeper of the elephants, was now the prime suspect in a series of horrific serial murders. It was a story that felt like it was ripped from a horror movie, not the local news. Friends, neighbors, and people who frequented the zoo couldn't reconcile the two images. Mild-mannered animal lover and the accused monster, the sense of betrayal was instant and deep. Investigators tracked Husky to his parents' mobile home in Pigeon Forge, the place where he went back to his quiet life after his dark escapades. A seemingly normal home that was holding some major secrets. They got a search warrant, and once they were inside, the case against him started getting stronger. A search of his bedroom turned up a ton of damning evidence. They found rope that looked just like the kind used to tie up some of the victims. But the most personal and incriminating finds were the souvenirs. Investigators found jewelry and other personal items they believed Husky had stolen from the women he murdered. Trophies he took to remember his kills. This was a classic sign of a serial killer, a way for him to relive the crimes and hold on to a piece of his victims. The unmasking was now complete. The quiet zookeeper image was shattered, replaced by the terrified picture of a cold, calculating predator who kept mementos of his murderers. The community that had once admired his work with animals now had to face the possibility that he was hiding a deep-seated hatred for women, a rage he unleashed on the most vulnerable people he could find. How could everyone be so wrong? And that question hung heavy in the Knoxville air. He had used trusted positions in the very institution the community loved as a cover for his horrible acts. The zoo, a place of life and wonder, had been a part of his ritual of death. The women he preyed on had called him the Zoo Man because he literally took them to the zoo, a place where he felt comfortable, where he was in control, and where no one ever could suspect the horrors happening just out of sight. The investigation had successfully found and caught their man, but this public revelation was just the start of a story that would get stranger and more complicated by the day. The evidence seemed like a slam dunk, but Thomas Husky had one more shock in store for everyone. A defense so bold it would turn the upcoming trial into a total circus and challenge the entire justice system. The unmasking of the zoo man was just the beginning of a legal saga that would leave everyone with more questions. This case goes so much deeper than you can imagine, right into the nature of identity and who's responsible for what. If you're finding this story as chilling as I am, take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. With Thomas Husky in custody, investigators felt like they were about to close the most horrific murder case in the county's history. They had physical evidence and witnesses. All they needed was a confession. The interrogation started, but what happened in that sterile interview room was something nobody saw coming. This is where the case took a sharp turn into the truly bizarre, and where investigators would meet the man they believed was the real killer. At first, Husky was exactly the guy everyone knew. Soft-spoken, reserved, and not very cooperative. He was arrested on October the 21st, 1992. In the days after, he invoked his right to remain silent, and then on October 30th, his right to an attorney. Legally, that should have stopped all questioning. But for reasons that would become a huge deal in court later, investigators started talking to him again several times in early November. It was during these legally questionable sessions that the Tom Husky facade began to crack and something or someone else came out. During one interview, an investigator stepped out of the room for a minute. When he came back in, the man in the chair was different. The quiet, mild-mannered Tom Husky was gone. In his place was a personality that was loud, aggressive, and demanding, and just filled with rage. The change was shocking. His voice, his words, his entire vibe had transformed. This new personality introduced himself. His name was Kyle. Kyle was everything Tom Husky wasn't. He was foul-mouthed, hostile, and had zero remorse. He looked at the investigators with pure contempt and, with a chilling arrogance, made them a deal. "Give me a cigarette," Kyle snarled, "and I'll tell you everything." And he did. In a taped confession that would become the absolute centerpiece of the case, the voice identified as Kyle admitted to it all. He confessed to kidnapping, raping, and strangling the 4 women. He talked about the murders with a cold, detached tone, describing his actions in brutal detail. At one point, he just said, "I throwed her down and left her lying there." He called his victims experiments and claimed he did it all specifically to hurt Tommy, the main personality he seemed to hate most. Most importantly, Kyle made it clear that he and the man whose body he was in were not the same. He warned the investigators, "You can't get me and Tommy mixed up." The investigators were floored. Was this just a desperate, elaborate act, or were they actually seeing a genuine psychological break? The performance was disturbingly convincing. Kyle was right-handed, but Tom Husky was a lefty. His mannerisms were different. His accent sounded distinct. To the detective in that room, it felt like they were talking to a completely different person. But Kyle wasn't the only one. During the interviews, another personality showed up. A man calling himself Philip Dax, who spoke with a fancy British accent and said his job was to protect Tom from the evil Kyle. Another personality, a shy, feminine character named Timmy, also made a quick appearance. The man in the interrogation room was a revolving door of different identities, each with their own voice, habits, and memories. Prosecutors would later argue that Husky, who they saw as a cunning manipulator, had stolen these personalities from a popular soap opera, Days of Our Lives, which had a storyline about multiple personalities. They even pointed out that a street near where Husky grew up was named Kyle, but the defense saw something totally different. They saw a deeply broken mind, a man so traumatized that his psyche had shattered into pieces just to cope. Kyle's confession wasn't Thomas Husky's confession, they would argue. It was a confession of a separate, evil alter ego that Tom couldn't control. The stage was now set for one of the strangest and most controversial murder trials in Tennessee history. A trial that wasn't just about one man's guilt, but about whether a man can be held responsible for what a personality he claims isn't his does. In 1999, 7 years after the first body was found, the murder trial of Thomas D. Husky finally kicked off. It wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. People called it Knoxville's trial of the century, and it got national attention, with Court TV broadcasting the whole thing. The case was so well known in East Tennessee that they had to bus a jury in from Nashville, 200 miles away, just to find people who hadn't already been swayed by years of intense local news coverage. The main question they had to answer was as complicated as it was weird. Was Thomas Husky a clever serial killer faking a mental illness, or was he a victim himself? A man with a fractured mind whose body was hijacked by a murderous alter ego. The defense countered with one of the weirdest and most controversial legal strategies you can imagine. Not guilty by reason of insanity, based on a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, or DID, what used to be called multiple personality disorder. They painted Tommy Husky as a gentle, polite, and mentally slow man with a low IQ who had suffered horrific childhood trauma and abuse, including being molested. This trauma, they argued, made his personality splinter into different alters. As a way to protect himself, Thomas Husky, the main personality, was innocent. The crimes, they insisted, were all committed by Kyle, a violent, out-of-control personality that Tom had no power over and no memory of. The courtroom turned into a battle of psychiatric experts. The defense's psychologist, Dr. Dana McCoy, testified that she had spent 55 hours evaluating Husky and was totally convinced his DID was real. She described meeting the different personalities and argued that a man with Husky's limited intelligence couldn't possibly fake such complex and consistent personas, especially the sophisticated Philip Dax. Husky's own ex-wife even testified that she had noticed these strange personality shifts when they were married. The prosecution brought in their own experts, including the famous Dr. Herbert Spiegel, to shoot down their claim. They painted Husky as a master manipulator, smart enough to fool even trained professionals. The question for the jury was huge. Was the quiet, reserved Thomas Husky sitting in front of them the real defendant? Or was the real killer an unseen entity named Kyle who had confessed on tape? The trial was packed with drama. During closing arguments, the defense attorney stepped into the witness box and pretended to be Kyle, trying to show the jury how inconsistent the alter's confession was. Prosecutor Randy Nichols, in response, basically preached to the jury, demanding they see through the act and deliver justice for the 4 murdered women. After 5 intense days of deliberation, the jury came back. They were deadlocked, and they had all agreed the first part. Thomas Husky's body had, in fact, committed the murders of at least 3 of the women, though they were split on the 4th. But they were hopelessly divided on the 2nd. And most important question, was he sane? The vote was a perfect split, 6-6. 6 jurors thought he was a sane, cunning killer who should be held responsible. The other 6 believed he was legally insane, a victim of a profound mental illness. Since the jury couldn't make a unanimous decision, the judge had no choice. On February the 13th, 1999, he declared a mistrial. After years of investigation and a trial that gripped an entire state, there was no verdict. The families of Patricia Anderson, Patricia Johnson, Darlene Smith, and Susan Stone were denied closure. The zoo man hadn't been convicted, but he hadn't been acquitted either. He was stuck in legal limbo, a man judged guilty in action but not in mind, leaving a huge cloud of frustration over the whole case. The mistrial was a gut punch to the prosecution and the victims' families. They had been so close to a conviction, only to be stopped by a psychiatric defense that literally split the jury in half. For a while, the state planned to retry the case and go for the death penalty again, hoping to convince a new jury that Husky was sane. But the legal maze of the Zoo Man case was about to get even more tangled. In the years after the mistrial, Husky's defense team just kept filing appeals, attacking every single piece of the state's case, and they started winning. In a shocking series of rulings, appellate courts took apart the very foundation of the prosecution's evidence. First, the courts ruled that the search of Husky's home was invalid. The warrant had been issued by a court commissioner instead of a judge, and that procedural screw-up meant that the evidence they found, the rope and the victim's jewelry, couldn't be used in the new trial. The trophies he had kept from his victims were now off the table. Then came even a bigger blow. The courts took a look at the confession tapes. The chilling admissions from Kyle. They ruled that because investigators had reinitiated contact with Husky after he had clearly asked for a lawyer, his Miranda rights had been violated. The confession? It was thrown out. Without the physical evidence from his bedroom and without the confession from his alter ego, the state's murder case was completely gutted. The prosecutor was left with almost nothing. In October of 2005, 13 years after the first body was found, the DA's office made a painful call. They formally dropped all 4 murder charges against Thomas D. Husky. In the eyes of the law, he was now legally blameless for the deaths of the 4 women. Justice for the murders, as the families understood it, was officially and permanently denied. However, Randy Nichols and his team had been playing the long game. Way before the murder trial even started, they had made a strategic choice not to jump straight into the death penalty case. Instead, they first prosecuted Husky for a series of other violent attacks, rapes and kidnappings he had committed against other women in the months and years before the killing spree. In those trials, the controversial DID defense wasn't used, and the evidence was much more clear-cut. The strategy turned out to be the key to keeping a violent predator off the streets. By 1996, years before the murder trial ended in a stalemate, Husky had already been convicted of 1 count of especially aggravated kidnapping and 3 counts of aggravated rape, among other charges. And for those crimes, he was sentenced to what added up to a 66-year prison term. So while Husky had technically gotten away with murder, he wasn't going to be a free man. The rape convictions made sure he would spend most, if not all, of his life behind bars. He sits in a Tennessee prison to this day, a convicted rapist, but never a convicted murderer. It was a weird and unsatisfying kind of justice. The lead detective on the case, Dan Stewart, later said he was frustrated with the outcome, saying, "We got beat by the system. He wasn't tried for it, but he did it." The one thing nobody can deny in this, after Thomas Husky was arrested, the string of brutal murders in East Knox County stopped for good. The story of Thomas D. Husky, the Zoo Man, is a chilling look at how 2 completely different people can exist inside one man. He showed a face of gentle compassion to the world while hiding a monster inside. He turned a place of public trust into a personal hunting ground and left behind a trail of ruined lives and unanswered questions. The legal system, with all its rules and complexities, ultimately couldn't deliver a clear verdict on the murders, leaving the community with a deep sense of injustice. Even though he was never convicted for the 4 lives he is believed to have taken, he was locked up for the violence he committed against others. A sort of backdoor justice that, while it worked, offers a little comfort to the families of his victims. The case leaves us with some really unsettling questions that are still hanging in the air decades later. Was Thomas Husky a victim of a broken mind, a man who was tormented by Kyle as his victims were? Or was he a smart, cunning psychopath who cooked up the perfect insanity defense and almost walked away completely free? Is a person not responsible for their actions if they committed it with a part of their mind they can't control? This case is a terrifying reminder that we may never really know the people walking among us, and that sometimes the worst kind of darkness can be found hiding behind the most ordinary mask. What do you think? Was the Zoo Man a master manipulator or a man genuinely broken into pieces by trauma? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, tell a friend. This is a dark room.